everyone, welcome back to the show. My name's Dan, this Exploder, and I'm here with another episode just for you. I know the period between episodes is getting a little longer. I'm sorry, real life gets in the way, and I'm going to try and make it more steady for anyone who's still listening. Thank you for coming along and joining me on this little adventure into the business we call pro wrestling. In a previous episode, I talked about power bombs of freedom, where I talked about patriotism, nationalism, and sometimes even jingoism when it comes to the heel-face dynamic in pro wrestling. And I've done other things, all these different topics, but I kind of started thinking, there's all these different aspects that affect pro wrestling, because pro wrestling is like anything else in life. There's good, there's bad, there's all these different factors that play into it. So that's why in this episode, I'm going to talk about the role of class in professional wrestling. Now, when I talk about class, I don't necessarily mean the high-class, hoity-toity, rich snobs, although that will come into play. What I am talking about is the idea of economic class. Economic class, on its face, doesn't look like it would be something that would be involved in pro wrestling, but the thing is, class is something that affects human beings on a personal level, a micro level, and macro level, and the pro wrestling business would be remiss if it didn't at least address these issues. Because, like I've said, pro wrestling is if nothing, a mere reflection of reality around it. Like I said, in Power Bombs of Freedom, the reason that some patriotism and soldiers and who the villain is at certain times, they are a reflection of society around it. So, of course, these different aspects will also be reflected. Now, in this one, there are different ways to break this down, but the first one I break down to is how the rich characters relate to the poor characters. Now, back in the Pioneer days was just a menagerie of working-class strongmen. One strongman in black trunks beat up another strongman in black trunks, and occasionally, one would really change it up and have a mustache. Hell, one of the most famous wrestlers of this era was named Farmer Burns. So the idea of economic class playing a role wasn't a huge thing in pro wrestling, and it wouldn't be up until about the 1940s and 50s with the advent of not only television, but television-friendly gimmicks like Gorgeous George. Gorgeous George wasn't just light on his feet, wearing a robe with blonde hair. He came to the ring with his own personal red carpet. He had a valet named Jeffries who carried a silver mirror for George to use and laid out rose petals for him to walk across. He'd even spray perfume, referred to as Chanel No. 10, in the ring to get rid of the stink of both his opponents and fans. Jeffries would even spray the hands of the referee before he checked George for weapons. This kind of arrogance, coupled with tensions between the burgeoning middle class and upper class people, led to George being the premier heel of the 1940s and 50s. Now, while the guy behind him playing such a very rich character, a ridiculous character even, the man behind it, George Raymond Wagner, actually dropped out of high school at 14. Worked odd jobs, and then started wrestling in carnivals. Here we are, the carnivals again, winning a crisp 35 cents when he won a match. And that's the kind of idea. The idea of the rich character is the heel. This would go on for many, many years, including legendary manager and anger management Lost Cause. Jim Cornette debuted in wrestling as a kayfabe rich kid whose mother bought his way into wrestling. Now, that's a very, very easy way to, when you bring in a guy like that as a heel, the easiest way to do is you have a bunch of guys who are wrestlers who earned their way, who were tough guys, and then you have this little rich, scrawny little rich kid whose Mama Cornette, bought his way in. Right there, immediately, there's a heel aspect there. He was a heel from day one, and that's why. And now he would build on that, but having that background at first, that right there immediately gets you heel heat. And you're going to see more of that as I go further and further into this. Now, in the 1980s were known for multiple things. 1, ridiculous fashion. 2, Ronald Reagan. And 3, unfortunately, cocaine. It was also known for yuppies. Yuppies stood for young urban professionals. They were the guys wearing the Brooks Brothers suits on their way to a party with, well, let's just not talk about it. Let's talk about the movie Wall Street. We're talking about, Michael Douglas playing this character and this up-and-coming, they had this Charlie Sheen as this up-and-coming stockbroker, and quite frankly, Michael Douglas was not a nice character. This was the stereotypical 1980s yuppie, win at all costs, make as much money as you can, and, don't worry about any of the consequences. Now, of course, this would also translate into other aspects, including pro wrestling. With the advent of a character played by Ted Dibiase, himself a guy who, the son of 2 pro wrestlers who traveled around the country, was really a self-made man, and you had someone, he would build the character of the $1 Million Man, Ted Dibiase. Now, the idea behind the $1 Million Man was simple. He was a guy who could buy anything, which immediately distanced himself from the blue-collar audience. Wrestling at the time for, different areas, but at this time, pro wrestling was very much a family thing. Family, parents would bring their kids. Their kids wanted to see Hulk Hogan beat up Monster of the Day. So when those families and those blue-collar workers show up to an event, and you're looking at a guy who's wearing a gold and rhinestone jacket, and he's paying people to do basically not even humiliating things necessarily, but just simple things. The fact that he was paying them to do it, to humiliate themselves, then he would cheat. If you bounce a ball so many times, you win this kind of money, which was, $100, which was nothing to the $1 Million Man, but then he'd cheat so that the guy didn't win. Often these were kids, or in one case, a very young Rob Van Dam. That's a weird little tidbit. But it was this guy, the blue-collar audience immediately has this reaction to someone who just flaunts their wealth. The $1 Million Man was the most prolific heel of his time. He would buy the WWF title from Andre the Giant, and when he was stripped by Jack Tunney, he created his own title, the $1 Million Championship. This belt was theoretically worth $1 million, of course, which actually about $300,000-$400,000, but it was commissioned simply for this character. He would also buy and sell contracts of wrestlers. Many times this was the culmination of someone turning heel, or turning babyface, as they were rejecting the $1 Million Man's money. This is the case of Hercules, and later the Big Boss Man. And believe me, I'll get to the Big Boss Man. Now, this was such a successful character. I mean, this character would start from the 1980s and run up until the mid-1990s. For a good 10 years, this was a character. Now, its level of influence has changed over time. As I'll mention, by the 90s, it wasn't as influential. But the character very much stayed the same. He was a rich guy who used his money to get whatever he wanted. Now, this was such a successful character, they would try to replicate it twice. First, with a guy named Tiger Ali Singh, who tried to replicate it by paying people to do embarrassing things like kiss his feet, bow down to him, or appear next to Tiger Ali Singh. The basic things. He had a manservant, I don't know how to put it, who would be known as Babu, was played by Pablo Marquez, who, I'll just say it, he was Puerto Rican. I don't know why he was playing like an Indian manservant to this Indian guy who Tiger Ali Singh is from Canada, and Babu was Puerto Rican. Wrestling's weird. Anyway, it didn't go well because, it's Tiger Ali Singh, and the character would go downhill very quickly, even though they were directly trying to replicate the $1 Million Man, which had been successful for over a decade. One that was slightly more successful, and especially in a main event capacity, was JBL. John Bradshaw Layfield was a rich, annoying Texan who used power, money, and influence to amass a team to keep him on top of the card. He would form his cabinet. He would have Orlando Jordan and the Bashams, and he had all these different people there to keep track of his money. He invested in the stock market, and remember, there was an episode of King of the Hill, and this is going to get a little esoteric, but bear with me here. There's an episode of King of the Hill where this investor comes in, they're trying to get this propane contract, and he's trying to get them to show him the real Texas. And all these guys are Texans, and they're Texans, and this guy's wearing the cowboy hat, and the jacket, and the boots, and calling everyone JR, and all these things. He's a rich, annoying guy who thinks he knows what a Texan is. That's pretty much what they did with JBL. They made him the most annoying, over-the-top Texas billionaire, Ross Perot with muscles you could probably ever find in your life. And he was only a one-time champion, but he held that belt for almost a year, which at that time was a hell of an accomplishment. So it's better than Tiger Ali Singh, not as influential in the long term as the $1 Million Man, but still playing that annoying Texan billionaire oil tycoon type stock market guy was really good, and it really hit the mark right when it needed to, the way it was. Now, one of the most unique things they did with that character was they once did an angle where he employed the somehow in dire straits Shawn Michaels, who basically says that he made bad investments and he was broke, despite the fact that literally he was actively working for the WWE at the time and brazenly shilling DX merchandise 2 segments later. So they would have a segment where Shawn Michaels would, sort of do whatever JBL told him to do because he worked for him, and then I swear to God, a segment or 2 later, they'd show a commercial where he and Triple H were shilling for some DX merchandise, which either says, A, he doesn't need the money as bad as he thinks he does, and he's just putting up with this for God knows why, or WWE doesn't pay its performers much in royalties. I don't know which one it is, but it kind of created a little cognitive dissonance there. This basic story here, JBL would eventually abuse Shawn Michaels until Shawn would finally fight back, and they would have a match, I believe, at No Way Out. It looked like it was something that was going to go to WrestleMania that year, and then for some reason they didn't. And if I remember correctly, that was the year, it was the first year he faced The Undertaker, if I remember correctly. But it looked like they were going to JBL. They finished it in February, and then the next the next month at WrestleMania, I believe he fought The Undertaker for the first time that year. And then there's the idea, so now we're talking, those are just the generalized rich characters. But what about the other end of the spectrum? What about the blue-collar workers? What about the workers who worked... There's a joke going around about the 1990s that wrestling was in such a bad shape that even the pro wrestlers had to have side jobs. And while that's actually true, especially on the independents, and that's still true today for many guys, but back in the 90s, if you were working for Smoky Mountain, well then yeah, you had a day job. But if you worked for WWE, you weren't making a whole lot of money, but you were seen as a TV guy. The biggest problem that would be at the time was they started assigning characters that were just jobs. And it was one of the major criticisms of the new generation era. They would just take guys and find something about their past and then make them that plus wrestling. They did that with Bob Holly. Bob Holly was actually a stock car racer, so they said, hey, screw it. You'll be Thurman Sparky Plug, which they later changed to Bob Spark Plug Holly. Like, that's a hell of a lot different. But the thing was, he actually did drive the WWF stock car, so it was a little different. But then they would often have these characters that were, you know, Jim the Fireman, who also wrestled for whatever reason. One of them was T.L. Hopper, Tony Anthony, not Mike Anthony. Who the hell's Mike Anthony? Anyway, Tony Anthony, who admittedly was a plumber when he worked for Smoky Mountain Wrestling. He made a big mistake of telling Vince McMahon that, and then he became T.L. Hopper. T.L. stands for toilet lid because Vince McMahon is 12 years old, and he was the wrestling plumber. Okay, I'm not sure where you go with that, but they tried. Firebreaker Chip, who was a firefighter, a literal firefighter. I don't know if he actually was one, but they made him one. He was part of Special Forces with Todd Champion. There's Duke the Dumpster Drosy, who was a garbage collector. And they eventually, they were going to have him sell out and give up garbage collecting and join the $1 Million Corporation. Drosy himself, I believe, showed some photos of that, of a photo shoot they did when he was supposed to turn, but they didn't end up doing it. But he was a garbage collector. And the thing was about blue-collar workers, where everyone I mentioned, with the exception, Drosy, if he would have turned, it would have been different, but everyone else, they were baby faces, because they were just hard-working people. No one really gave a crap about T.L. Hopper or Firebreaker Chip, but they were baby faces by default because they were blue-collar workers. They reflected the audience that was watching them. Because honestly, there were people in that audience who probably were, most likely, they were plumbers. They were firefighters. They were garbage collectors. They were clowns. Okay, no clowns. No clowns were in the audience, thank God. But they were baby faces by default. Now, if they were a heel, in some cases, which I'll get to, they were a heel by their own actions, not necessarily because of the job. Now, this also changes a little bit when we're talking about perceptions of the job itself. Not the reality, but the perception of it. A good example of that is Isaac Yankem, DDS. Isaac Yankem was, again, the 90s were a glorious time. Isaac Yankem was a dentist with bad teeth. He was Jerry Lawler's personal dentist. Why you need a personal dentist, I don't know, but whatever. Now, this goes to the perception of a dentist, and famously, the story goes that Vince McMahon himself did not like the dentist, and that was the idea for the character. I don't know. So, no one likes going to the dentist. I mean, even the people that take care of their teeth immaculately, no one likes going to the dentist. That's just a generalized thing. No one likes going to the emergency room, but you acknowledge that it's possible, and you acknowledge that it's something you need to do sometimes. No one wants to go to the dentist, but it's just something you do. And even from a young age, you form, quite frankly, a negative notion of what a dentist is. So they take this character, this job you already don't like. You already don't like going to the dentist. And then you add a couple things, the messed up teeth, these associated with Jerry Lawler, and you crank that up, and you create a natural heel. This also came into effect when we're talking about the IRS tax collector, Erwin R. Shyster, IRS. Again, very straight to the point. Now, again, IRS itself is a necessary evil. I know there's philosophical and political, blah, 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 I don't care. But some people, I don't think anyone likes paying taxes, but some people acknowledge, well, this is something you have to do. You have to pay taxes. Well, IRS was a character, the gimmick, the guy, Mike Rotunda, was IRS. And he was always worried about tax cheats. And he would steal from people, and he would accuse everyone of being a tax cheat, including Vince McMahon, which I think is probably the funniest thing in the world, to actively call your boss a tax cheat as a character he gave you. Whatever, not the point. But this was the idea. The idea was that the IRS, again, a character you're innately not a fan of. No one likes paying taxes. So this blue-collar work ethic that's sitting in the audience immediately is not going to like the guy with the slick-back hair and suspenders who looks them in the eye and calls them a tax cheat. They're not going to like that. So that kind of thing that immediately has a gut reaction, and when you take that and then you play it up and you put him with Ted DiBiase as Money Inc., you have a natural heel right there. Now, IRS himself, Mike Rotunda, would eventually go to WC, would sort of go back and forth, but he ended up at WCW, and he would be Michael Wall Street, and then eventually VK Wall Street, or Mr. Wall Street, or whatever Wall Street, and that's what he played. He played the Michael Douglas character. He was a Wall Street type with the slick back hair and the nice suit, and you hated him because he was a different kind of rich guy. The IRS guy was the guy who was calling you a tax cheat, and VK Wall Street was the guy who was probably cheating the tax system. But that's wrestling. Now, this would also come into a case with the guys like the Repo Man. Now, again, Repo Man is a necessary evil. You know, Repo Man, the repo industry exists because people don't make their payments. They have to reacquire the stuff, and it makes actually some moderately interesting reality television. It's something that happens. But again, a blue collar mindset looks at someone like a Repo Man, and they're probably not a fan of it because maybe they've had something of theirs repossessed, or maybe they've had a family member or a friend. And while theoretically the idea is good, they're not a fan of it. And then when you take someone like Repo Man, and then you just had him exaggerate, like wrestling, turn it up to 11. So the exaggeration is he didn't just take stuff that was owed, he would take stuff that he wanted to take. He was just a bad guy. I mean, he would take Repo Man back in the Raw days. He repossessed Macho Man Randy Savage's hat, which I could not imagine a scenario where Macho Man Randy Savage would have to make payments on a cowboy hat. But whatever. But he repossessed it, and then there was an angle about him getting it back and things like that. That is pro wrestling 101. You take a character, you take a job that's already got a general feeling or a general sympathy toward it, and then you just turn it up a little bit. The Repo Man's a good example of that. Of course, Dusty Rhodes is a great one. Dusty Rhodes is one of the most charismatic wrestlers of all time, and I don't think anyone's going to dispute that. But when he came to the WWF, they put him in polka dots and put him in sapphire, but he was also the American dream. He played up that he was the literal son of a plumber. He was a working class hero, and that right there, the polka dots weren't the greatest thing. Sapphire wasn't the greatest person as far as a performer, but that working class, son of a plumber, American dream character, it resonated. And Dusty Rhodes had such charisma about it that it really played up. That crowd, again, they could see themselves reflected in a guy like Dusty Rhodes. Now, he's Dusty Rhodes, and he'd been a wrestler at that point for decades. And he's, this bigger-than-life character who wore, fur coats and all those things. But when he came to the ring and he's dancing to, the song, Common Man, that song, that amazing song, Common Man, people felt that, and they reflected themselves in a guy like Dusty Rhodes. Now, when we're talking about professions, this blue-collar aesthetic, this blue-collar sympathy would change dramatically when it comes to, of all people, cops. The Big Boss Man, when he came in, he was immediately a heel. Now, Big Bubba Rogers was just a general bodyguard for Jim Cornette and all these things, but when the Big Boss Man came in, he was a prison guard. He had the police uniform, what have you. Cobb County, Georgia, which is against the shoot. He was a prison guard. But he was a heel. He was immediately a heel. That kind of character. And why? Because they took the character, they turned it up a little bit. He was a guy who beat you with a nightstick. He wasn't just a regular guy. He was a prison guard who was also a jerk. The Mountie. The Mountie's a good example of that. The Mounties, by and large, I'm not Canadian, but by and large, the Mounties are a very respectable police force. But when you take Jacques Rougeau and you make him the Mountie, and you give him a little cattle prod, a little red cattle prod, he immediately became this heel because you have this perception of he's a bad cop. Let's put it that way. He's a bad cop. WCW even had a tag team called the State Patrol. And that's what they were. They were like drill sergeants / State Patrol guys who were they were low-level heels. They were on the B&C shows, but they were heels. And these were bad cops. So that's one I found was really interesting, is the relation of cops to the blue-collar audience. 9 times out of 10 were heel. Now, it's not to say they couldn't be baby faces, because the Big Boss Man later turned. The Big Boss Man would eventually, like I mentioned with Ted DiBiase, he would turn. And Big Boss Man would be a baby face for a while. But the initial feel of some of these characters, when you talk about law enforcement, they're by default heel unless something changes, which I always thought was very unique. One unique case of class in relation to pro wrestling was that of Jamie Noble, whose gimmick was that he was a trailer park dwelling white trash character. Now, if you grew up in or live in a trailer park, I'm not saying that about you. I'm saying that's what this character was. This character was designed to be the most, white trash, crystal methist, cousin kissing, sister God knows what, horrible character. Now, this character, with him, Jimmy Noble and Nydia, would change slightly when Noble, who no act of his own, would somehow inherit 6 figures from a kayfabe dead aunt. And then it showed how a admittedly low class character would act frivolously or haphazardly with newly acquired money. And the money would eventually, when he would return, the money would be gone, and he would sort of play off a different way. So I think that's, I kind of forgot about that one, honestly. I was doing the research on that one. I forgot about that one. I knew about the white trash part, but yeah, the money thing, I forgot about that, and I thought that was a little bit unique. And James Noble, by the way, is one of the unsung heroes of the Ruthless Aggression era. When SmackDown and Raw first split, one of the characters that sort of came out on its own, in addition to Matt Hardy version 1, was Jamie Noble. So that's another guy we don't talk enough about. Another was the saga of Diamond Dallas Page in the mid-90s in WCW. Diamond Dallas Page was, basically shown for what he was. He was a New Jersey nightclub promoter type. He came out with cigars, and he had a beautiful, I don't know what he considered, but he had the Diamond Doll, who was his real life wife at the time, and all this money. And then they did an angle where he lost all his money. He lost it, and then he started to show it. He would come out, and he had, his facial hair was even scruffier, and his tights were sagging and ripped, and he was looking, he was broke, and it looked like it. And then out of nowhere, some mysterious benefactor came in, and Diamond Dallas Page, that we know and learn yoga from, came back, and he was wearing all this ridiculous stuff again. And I always thought that was funny when you see one character sort of go from, the top to the bottom and then back to the top, before they developed this character that Diamond Dallas Page was during the NWO. In the 94, 95, 96, Diamond Dallas Page was... There was sort of an up and down there, which I just thought was really unique, and I hadn't really thought about until I started doing research for this episode. Then there's a relation between bosses and workers. Now, and not just when I've talked about professions with blue collar and white collar and the guys that have money and the guys that don't, but let's talk about direct comparisons. We're talking about bosses compared to workers. Because working, and I'm not going to get into philosophical or, I'm not here to try and make you a communist. I don't know what they're telling you out there. I am not the communist podcast host. There's 50 others. Go talk to them. I'm not trying to... But there is a class struggle that comes from the workplace. And I don't mean in the philosophical sense. I mean in the real sense. How many people don't like their boss? How many people right now would probably go out and punch their boss in the face in the parking lot if they thought they could get away with it? There's a lot of hands being raised right now, and I thank you for that. But, that's the thing when we're talking about workers. I don't mean in the communist way. I mean in just the general, personal way. Not, workers, you can get along with your boss. At the end of the day, you don't necessarily like them. Unless you work for yourself. In which case, if you hate your boss, there's a lot more going on there than I can really help you with in a podcast. So you do you. That brings us back to Ted Dibiase. One of the dynamics with Ted Dibiase was not only how he spent his money and how he did what he did as a heel character, it was also how he treated the people around him. For years, he had the character Virgil. Virgil was first of all, like I said in an episode of Spike Club, he was a joke on Dusty Rhodes, because that's Dusty Rhodes' first name, Virgil. But Virgil was his bodyguard, manservant, and they would do this off screen too. That was the thing about keeping kayfabe. Virgil would drive him from place to place. Virgil would open the door for him. Virgil would, so as far as the public was concerned, Virgil literally worked for Ted DiBiase. And the Virgil story, as it was told for years. I believe it was 5 years, if I remember correctly, because I think it was 87, and then Virgil turned on him in 92. So I think it was, 5 years, where the story of Virgil was that he was a guy who was fully involved, Ted DiBiase, the $1 Million Man, treated him like crap for years, and then finally at the end, he went a bridge too far, and he abused him too far, and Virgil would rebel against him, and then face off the guy who'd employed him for so long. They faced off one-on-one for the $1 Million title. Virgil would win the title, and you know how that works. Which actually, again, it's still Virgil, but it was a good story overall. That was actually a really good story. And it was told a very long term. That was a very long-term story, but at the end, the payoff was actually pretty good, even though it, included Virgil. DiBiase would later, in the 90s, he would do Money Inc. with IRS, as I mentioned, and then by the mid-90s, he would amass the $1 Million Corporation. He would literally buy the services of guys like Nikolai Volkov, who had as far as kayfabe was concerned, fallen on hard times and really didn't want to be there. And judging by his work in 1996, he really shouldn't have been, but I digress. And then there's the story of Tatanka. Tatanka sold out in 1994, where Dibiase literally paid him off, and the proud Native American turned his back on his culture and his friends and Lex Luger and all these people to join the $1 Million Corporation. And again, that was another one where week to week, that was, although it was done at a time where WWE was in the really, it was in a sinkhole. At the time, it was, for what it was a very well done storyline. And it was week to week, and you really thought Lex Luger was going to turn, and then they turned to Tatanka, and it was done really well. And the sellout thing, and that was actually pretty brilliant. Going over to WCW, Eric Bischoff, long before Vince McMahon was Mr. McMahon, and believe me, we'll get to him. Eric Bischoff was abusing his power as president of WCW while also being in the NWO. He would fire referees for having the temerity to do their jobs. Guys like Randy Anderson. He would strip the Steiners of the tag team titles for, winning them. Stuff like that. So again, this is not necessarily rich when we're talking about class. We're not talking necessarily about financial. Well, I'm sure Eric Bischoff made a pretty penny. This was about a boss. This is about a corrupt boss who you wanted to punch in the face. Every time the NWO would get something happen to them, Eric Bischoff would pull, he'd pull the card. He would strip the people the tag titles. He would fire the referee. So this was another thing. You wanted to get back at this boss because the boss, even though he wasn't your boss, there was a general working class guy on the lines who's upset at the guy sitting in the office. So, and this would be played up to the nth degree with characters later on like Mr. McMahon, and like I said, I will get to him. Then there's Alberto Del Rio, who became, long before he became a train wreck and possibly inmate number 23416, Alberto Del Rio was a Mexican aristocrat from a famous wrestling family. He rode to the ring in limos, he had his own ring announcer, and he played this rich foreigner to a T. They turned him babyface to go against the really American Jack Swagger, but to do that, they had to sort of undermine the Del Rio-Ricardo Rodriguez relationship, and they tried to make it more of a friendship than the fact that he had been employing and abusing Rodriguez for years up to this point. Kind of weird. Then they switched it back because he became a heel again, so... But yeah, that was another thing. For that character, for the Alberto Del Rio character as it was, to be a babyface, they kind of had to retcon, it's an old comic book term. They kind of had to retcon it. They had to make the character not as overbearing as he clearly was. So him as a babyface didn't really make sense, and that kind of rich character as a babyface didn't make any sense. So that's why they switched it back as soon as they possibly could. Jinder Mahal came into the WWE as a rich Indian with family connections who bossed around the Great Khali for a while, because I guess the Great Khali needed money. He later ended up as a member of an air band, but he was fake rich for a minute there, so that's good. Then there's the change between The Rock. The Rock went from the People's Champion, which had grown naturally over time, from the Nation. He became the People's Champion, and then at Survivor Series 1998, he turned on that and became the Corporate Champion, becoming a corporate sellout to McMahon's. And you want to talk about heat. When you have a guy like The Rock, who's the People's Champion, who's been fighting against Mr. McMahon, and all these things, and then he turns. And not only does he turn, but he turns on a top guy. And he turns, and then the opposite of that is someone like Mick Foley, who's very working class. And they played that up. They played up his background. They played up The Rock played up Mick being from Long Island, and he was from a small family, and his parents worked in the schools, and they really played this up. The fact that he was from Long Island, there was a lot of this at the time was the aesthetic of the sellout. The corporate sellout. That was the thing. The Rock here was the sellout, and Mick Foley, Mankind, whatever you want to call it, was the champion of the people. Well, I mean, People's Champion was already taken, but you know what I mean? That was the thing. It was very much a corporate overthrow, corporate overtake versus the working class hero that was Mick Foley. During the middle of this, Mr. McMahon and Shane McMahon would actually literally create a group called the Corporation, which fought against a group called the Union, which included disaffected members from the corporation, including the temporarily ousted Mr. McMahon, until the higher power, well, you know the rest. That brings us to Mr. McMahon. Mr. McMahon is the stereotypical annoying asshole boss. Now, Vince McMahon's background itself, oddly enough, is actually very blue-collar. He's a blue-collar billionaire, but he knows how to be the cocky jackass that he himself does not like. about Vince McMahon spent a good chunk of his childhood in a trailer park in North Carolina with his mother and stepfather. He didn't live with his father until he was a teenager, and he came to know the WWF business, and famously he was given a promotion. He was given an area to promote in Maine and told, if you don't make this work, don't even come back to me. His father said this, don't come back to me to talk about being in the business ever again. He would later on go on to buy the company from his father and make it into what it is today. But this is a guy who, quite frankly, for the longest time didn't have a lot of money and spent money and lost money and was very much a blue-collar guy trying to make himself into something bigger with more money in his bank account, and now he's a billionaire. So it very much is I don't know if you'd say rags to riches, but very similar to that. And he is very blue-collar, but he also knows the kind of people he didn't want to be. So he would simply take the idea of the jackass boss, the overbearing boss, and that created the Mr. McMahon character. This would also transfer to his son Shane. Shane would again grow up. He would become this character who was a spoiled rich kid. That was the Shane McMahon character that was part of the corporation, and at one point even kicked Mr. McMahon out and created the corporate ministry and all these different things. He was a spoiled rich kid. And he would, in reality, Shane McMahon himself worked many low-level WWF positions growing up, including the warehouse. And he was the kind of guy who, yes, his father owned the company, but he wasn't necessarily a guy who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He did well for himself and even left the company to do his own thing in real life. But it was a kind of character, again, they played up what people perceived him to be. They're just a spoiled rich kid. That also translates to the Mean Street Posse, who were Shane McMahon's group of friends from the mean streets of Greenwich, Connecticut, the tough place. Anyway, the idea was that this was, everyone knows somebody like this who's rich or has some kind of money, but they're completely unaware. They think they're tough. That was what the Mean Street Posse was, to back up to a guy like Shane McMahon. It was the completely unaware rich kid who pretended like they grew up on the street. They grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, which, if probably one of the highest per capita salaries in the entire country. They're kind of characters where they had it easy, and but they dressed like they were from the streets. And it was also the sweater vest. You gotta hate anyone who wears a sweater vest like that. You have to hate. Those are the rules. This guy actually came in handy a couple years ago. There was a case of Deion Sanders, his son, said something on Twitter about hood donuts. And then Primetime reminded him publicly that he had a trust fund, a condo, his own fashion line, and oh yeah, his dad was Deion Sanders. Again, the completely unaware rich kid. Like, sometimes you gotta be brought down, and sometimes it's a little embarrassing when it's your father, But again, this kind of thing, and even then, again, talking about reality, Pete Gas, if I remember correctly, Pete Gas, who was a legitimate friend of Shane McMahon, who legitimately grew up in Greenwich, said that, quite frankly, he had a relatively modest upbringing, for Greenwich, Connecticut, by their standards. But, the idea that these three guys show up wearing sweater vests and they're the Mean Street Posse, it created heat. The three guys got heel heat, three guys that nobody really knew who they were, which says a lot about the character. Then you're talking about Steph Mcmahon. Steph Mcmahon was the $1 billion princess. She took that $1 billion princess and everyone in that family, minus the robotic Linda McMahon, play up their roles as the evil, entitled, rich boss, and they've done that well. Now they've become, Vince is sort of the elusive figure who's not around much, and Shane McMahon's sort of in and out playing that character, and Steph McMahon's become someone who just slaps everybody and gets away with it. But for the longest time, those three really played up the rich character. And that's also why, especially talking about the corporation, that's why something like the corporation and the corporate ministry and all these different characters, that's why they worked off a guy like Stone Cold Steve Austin, because, and this is not new ground here, I'm not breaking any ground, but that's the dynamic. The dynamic was, again, who doesn't want to punch their boss? This guy gets not only punch his boss, he gets to run over his boss's car and attack him and get him arrested and pour beer on him. I mean, this was the ultimate blue-collar fantasy of the overbearing boss just constantly getting his comeuppance. And the back and forth between Mr. McMahon and Steve Austin, and Steve Austin in this case representing the blue-collar workers all over this country, putting those two together was a stroke of pure genius. And one of the reasons, if not the major, probably the most important reason, why the Attitude Era really worked and why Steve Austin was the biggest drawing performer in WWE's history. Because, again, it's something that goes to the most base level of people who aren't exactly thrilled with their boss and have a chance to get one up on their boss and get away with it. Not only get away with it, but get paid. And that's something that we all want to do, but not everyone can. But Steve Austin, week after week, could. And that's what made him such a great character. So when we talk about class. And then there's, in addition to, like I said, money, and then we're talking about boss and worker relationships, then there's just the upper class in general. These are very more basic characters, but this is something that still very much works when we're talking about the upper class heels. The guys who are just snooty, and they literally, in some cases, turn their nose up at people. These are very, again, more basic characters, but damn it if they don't got heel heat. The original idea for Hunter Hearst Helmsley was, this was done, as I mentioned in, I think I remember this in Spike Club, which was actually one of the first episodes of this podcast. It was done as a slight against Vince McMahon's new neighbors when he moved to Greenwich. Vince McMahon had lived, a different place around the country, but he never lived in Greenwich, Connecticut. He moves into Greenwich, Connecticut, and he's around a lot of, he's considered new money, which I always think is a hilarious designation with these people that my great-grandfather, owned a ship or something like that. And then, Vince McMahon, who recently made a lot of money, he's new money. I think that's hilarious. But that's what this character was. Hunter Hearst Helmsley was this French aristocrat who wore riding boots and had a crop and his hair in a ponytail, and was this upper class, drank brandy and all this crap. And he slayed this upper class snob until he started moving away from it toward more of a realism with Shawn Michaels. He sort of became who he was. But as long as he was Triple H, or not even Triple H, he was Hunter Hearst Helmsley. He was this take on the old money, polo playing types. He was a definitive heel, and there was really no way to make that a babyface. That's the kind of character it was. Or there was Lord Steven Regal. Now, I'm not talking about William Regal. William Regal sort of created that, again, gotten that elder statesman. And even then later in his WWE career, he was this British, just a tough guy. And you didn't like him, but man, you knew he was tough. But early, Lord Steven Regal was one of the only heels, and I'll say this straight up. My dad's been watching wrestling for years. He used to actually watch Big Time Wrestling. He used to run through Lima. He used to watch guys, the Sheik and all these guys, Bobo Brazil and the Crusher and all these guys that would come through here. And he's been watching wrestling for decades. And one of the only heels he ever legitimately did not like was Lord Steven Regal. And again, my dad's very much that. My dad's very much a blue-collar guy. He's been a truck driver, security guard, construction worker, all these different things. And that's snootiness. And he's literally said that to me. And he's like, oh, he thinks he's ever better than everybody. And he'll catch himself and he'll go, yeah, like he knows it's a gimmick, but it's something that at a base level, at a guttural human level, it bothers him. Because that Lord Steven Regal, that character, was so snotty and so better than not only Americans, but the lower class, and the way he did. And another guy who legitimately turned his nose up at people. And that was another really interesting one where they created the Blue Bloods. He had Jeeves, and then he had Sir William, which was his butler for a while, and then he had Bobby Eaton. Now, Bobby Eaton, of course, is from Alabama, part of the Midnight Express, and Stan Lane and Jim Cornette had left the company, and Bobby Eaton was sort of floating around, doing job work, training guys at the power plant, things like that. And so they did this whole angle where Steven Regal was looking for a tag team partner, and he was facing, this is again back when WCW Saturday Night was the A show. That was the main show because Nitro hadn't come along yet. And he was facing off against Bobby Eaton in these matches, and finally at the end, Steven Regal decides he's going to make Bobby Eaton his tag team partner, but it wasn't enough to simply just tag. It couldn't just be Lord Steven Regal and Bobby Eaton, beautiful Bobby Eaton. No, he had to change him. So then they do these vignettes, which I've actually put on the page before. These vignettes about how, which is actually, for what they were really well done, was Lord Steven Regal classing up Bobby Eaton and teaching him how to do things the proper way. And so then Bobby Eaton became Earl Robert of Eaton. And that was sort of the character, and that became the Blue Bloods. And actually for a Saturday Night tag team, for before Nitro, before the Monday Night Wars were really in play. It was a very good tag team, and it was done really well. And again, we're talking about class. That's what this was. They took a guy like Bobby Eaton, and they classed him up, and he spoke with a higher diction, and he turned his nose up at people, and it was completely, it was like Tommy Rich's an Italian level fake, but that was the point of the character. The point was this guy had bought into it, and he became this Earl Robert of Eaton, but he's still Bobby Eaton. He's still from Alabama, even though he was, turning his head up and reading the Wall Street Journal and so on and so forth. So that was, again, nice. Those segments were actually pretty nice, and the way it was done was pretty cool. Speaking of rich people who just had money, we're talking about Johnny Polo. The Johnny Polo character was, although a manager in WWE and the WF in the early 90s, he was basically a trust fund kid who was wasting his days managing people like the Quebecers and Adam Baum. I mean, if you were managing any one of those three, you were probably wasting your time. But yeah, that was sort of the idea. He was a trust fund kid. He was Johnny Polo, and he had a polo mallet. He was, think of like Billy Madison, like that. Like if Billy Madison was somehow like way more annoying, that was Johnny Polo. Scott Levy, the guy behind it, who admittedly grew up pretty well off. His dad was the head of the National Enquirer, and they did pretty well for themselves. He revisited this idea, although a different character, but in 1999, when Raven, his Raven character, temporarily revealed that he was a miserable rich kid. He and Canyon returned to his childhood home, which up to this point, Raven had been portrayed as this punk and grunge and this, dirty street rat from the Bowery. And then you find out he shows up to this stereotypical Florida McMansion, and all he did was complain about how, his life was so hard and all these things, and you realize he's just a whining rich kid, which I like Raven. I like the character. I didn't care for this as much. Raven says the guy behind, Scott Levy himself, liked it because he said it added depth to the character. And hey, it's his character, so I'm not gonna argue with the guy who created it. But that was also a little glimpse, and you actually saw this sort of this whining rich kid who just was miserable, even though he had a pretty good life. And the last topic I want to cover here, I want to talk about the role of education. Now, education by itself is not a bad thing, and I don't think most people look at the educated as, oh, they're bad. I think if you look at somebody with an education as a bad person, that says more about you than it does others. But in professional wrestling, there is a relation to how highly educated characters are treated in pro wrestling. One thing I've learned is that teachers, by and large, are heels. That's what they are. Shane Douglas, who admittedly was also a teacher named Troy Martin, was a middle school teacher while wrestling for ECW, would eventually stop teaching full-time and work for the WF, and he would come in as Dean Douglas. This character was, by the way, he looked like he got ran over by the Magic School Bus, but that's not his fault. And he gave out grades, and he went out of his way to lecture fans and other wrestlers about what the proper thing was and how to be a proper wrestler. And so I don't think it was necessarily that he was educated, but it was that he was arrogant about it. So there's this distrust of a little bit of education, and then you add, like with the Repo Man, you turn it up a little bit. So now he wasn't just educated, he was cocky about it. He was mean about it. So that kind of thing, it sort of turned it up a little bit. Not necessarily that they don't like teachers, but they don't like this teacher. Because this guy's really educated, and he lets you know about it. They would try this again years later with Matt Stryker. He was a wrestler, and yes, he had a background as a teacher. And he would use his background and his education to talk down to the audience. And he would use fancy words and all of these things. He would try to teach the audience. And again, the audience is not necessarily that they don't like teachers, but they don't like being talked down to. So again, you take this perception and then you just turn it up a little bit. So he talked down to the audience. So when you do that, you're immediately going to get heel heat. Lanny Poffo is the genius, which is one I don't think a lot of people talk about, but he would often pontificate through poetry, which angered a lot of the blue-collar crowd and their kids. I mean, honestly, it's like Gorgeous George. Back in the day, people went to wrestling shows to see wrestlers, and they didn't want to see some guy wearing a robe and spraying perfume, and that was kind of what made them mad. Now, it was heel heat. Of course it was, but that was kind of the thing. That's what made it heel heat. They didn't necessarily want to see that. People didn't want to hear Lanny Poffo or the Genius wearing a full-on graduation robe reading poetry. That's kind of not what you go for in wrestling. I don't think there's many people who want to go like, hey, let's go to the wrestling show. Let's go. There'll be a guy reading poetry there. Oh, I am in. I am in for that. But again, that's heel heat, and that's the point. The latest example of that would be Damien Sandow. Damien Sandow was literally called the intellectual savior of the WWE. He would do the same thing. He would use articulate speech. He would talk down to the audience. He would make a point to not only differentiate himself from other wrestlers, but from the crowd. He was smarter than you. He was going to inform you and educate you, and he was going to teach you the right way to do things. He did one little thing, which I don't know how many people caught this, but I loved it. It was beautiful. Most people hold a microphone, they hold it like they're holding a gear shift. You just hold it in your hand, holding a bundle of sticks or something like that. He held the microphone, because they had that little box on it, the little flag box. He would hold the thing like a wine sifter, which was so brilliant. Such a small detail. But it was like the guy who holds the little wine sifter and like swirls it to get the, I don't do wine, it's not my thing, but he would that was how he held the microphone. And it was such a small detail. But again, that little bit of cockiness, that little bit of arrogance, that little bit of over sophistication, that was enough to piss off the audience. So again, in these cases, everyone I just mentioned, they're very intelligent. And in any other field of work, they'd be good people to work for or work with. But the fact that they were characters in pro wrestling, all they had to do was basically turn up their intelligence and speak down to the audience and lecture them, and they become heels. Because at this point, education is, I wouldn't say it a hindrance, but it doesn't help your personality. And that's one of the most unique parts of pro wrestling, is the role of education as a negative in this way. Well, I know I went off on this for a while. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you liked looking at wrestling in a little different lens. I have some other topics I'm going to get into. Some are really fun. I mean, not that this wasn't fun, but there are ones that are fun. Some that are more serious, but I'm going to get into wrestling in a different aspect. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Like I said, I am working with a bunch of people on a bunch of things. The Gromy Show is coming back in June. I know it's really early, but I'm excited. It's going to be fun to get back. We're going to be getting back into the swing of things. So check out The Gromy Show. It's going to be coming out. It will be on ZTO. I'm working with Drift Compatible. We are working on not only another telethon this year, which is probably going to be around Halloween, so I know very early. But we're going to start filming probably the next few months, get stuff together and putting scripts together. A long-term project with them, which again, I'm not going to reveal until we're ready to print and ready to go. I want to say congratulations to actually, I didn't really plan on this, but he's a really good guy, Bob Yates, who was actually my neighbor when I first started, when he first moved to Ohio. And I've known Bob Yates since he was 5 or 6 years old. Very good guy. He is about to have a book come out. He is finishing up final touches on it, but he's going to have a book come out. Check out that when I know that's going to be available through pretty much everywhere. And when that actually comes out, I will post a link or whatever. I don't know how it's going to be sold or where, but I'm going to put a link to it. I'm going to help that guy out because he's a really great guy. Check out the ZTO podcast, Murder Fluent, Last Round of Poor Show, Something About Sports, Time for Tacos, my other podcast, Hillbilly Therapy, where I am co-host with Jake Hill. And another one is Hillbilly Bougie. Not a podcast, but it is an album out by Mary Santor. Mary Santor has been doing comedy now for, I believe, 10 years. Very talented comic. She is just about to blow up. And her album right now, I think it's got up to 21 or 22 in total on Amazon, like all albums on Amazon. She is doing really well. Check that out. I will, if nothing else, I'll put a link below the video on Facebook or whatever. But check that out. It's really well selling, and she's a very funny comic. So check her out. So I think I'm done shilling everything. So until next time, my name's Dan. This is Exploder. Have a good one.